Our next speaker is Hal Culbertson. Hal is the executive director of Notre Dame's Kroc Institute for International Peace. Hal joined the institute in 1997 and has been the center of the development of this institute since that time. For those of you that are not familiar with the Kroc Peace Institute, it is an impressive organization on this campus in terms of their analysis, in terms of their teaching, and in terms of their activism. And this is a group that you probably will want to explore further. Early on, Hal worked in Bangladesh for 3 years, working with local NGOs. Hal will analyze the NGO interaction with business and government in conflict and post-conflict situations. And in doing this, he will use the strategic peace-building framework developed by the Peace Institute. Hal.
Thank you, Lee. Over the last few years, it's been a great privilege to work with both Lee and Ali on a number of joint initiatives between the Kroc Institute and the Mendoza College. And I appreciate the opportunity yet again to have some interaction with the College of Business and the great initiatives that you're doing. As both Ali and Lee know, in my view, business has great untapped potential for peace building. And that I won't go into that right now, but I think my presentation today will highlight why I think that's the case. Just to give you a brief outline of where I'm going with the presentation, I'd like to begin with a brief background on the nature of contemporary conflict and how that's helped shape peace-building initiatives. And as Lee mentioned, I will highlight this concept of strategic peace-building as an approach to dealing with contemporary conflicts. I then will turn to business-NGO collaboration in the area of peace-building. I want to look at a few trends going on in the field and make a few observations. I know that some of you may have hopes for a discussion of business-NGO relations more widely. I think the answer to that is brand loyalty on my own part. As much as I'd like to talk about the environment and human rights and other issues, I work for a peace institute, so I'm going to focus on peace issues. But I think many of my conclusions will apply to other business-NGO relationships, as you will see. I begin with a brief caveat or disclaimer here. There is a bit of the elephant in the room phenomenon here. The MDGs themselves, interestingly enough, do not mention peace and conflict at all. They are about development and economic kinds of issues and human rights and things like that. And so why am I even talking about peace and conflict? Well, I think the answer is clear. Conflict is one of the most significant threats to achieving the MDGs, as is widely acknowledged. And as some have put it, I think Paul Collier of the World Bank put it most poignantly, violent conflict is development in reverse. When countries move into serious conflicts, resources that should be used for development and meeting the needs of the poor and other good causes are often redirected to the war effort, both by the government and rebels. And the efforts lead to the destruction of property and human lives, all of which puts development into reverse. And so the cases where the MDGs are not being met typically coincide with a number of places that are experiencing violent conflicts. I'm also pleased to point out that both the committees of the MDGs that focus on them, the Global Compact itself, have given significant attention to the role of peace and conflict. And I want to add my praise for doing that, because it would have been possible to kind of try and avoid this issue. But the Global Compact has taken it head on. And I think that's exactly the right way to go. So, a little bit about contemporary conflict and its implications for peace building. As many have pointed out, conflict after the Cold War has taken on characteristics quite different from the characteristics of war and civil wars before the end of the Cold War. One thing, perhaps the biggest change, has been the rise of civil wars as the primary form of violent conflict. And I'll show you a slide in a second to document the rise of civil wars. But as you might imagine, along with the rise in civil war, we see a number of other aspects of conflict that have been changing. One is the increased proportion in civilian deaths, often through violence that's directed at civilians rather than militants. I didn't put all the statistics up here, but perhaps the most telling statistic is that from the beginning of the 20th century to the end of the 20th century, the number of proportion of civilian deaths moved from about 10 to 15% to almost 90%. So in most conflicts today, 90% of the victims are civilians. Quite a change in warfare that we see in the 20th century. We also see a rise in displacement, both internally and refugee status in other countries. The conflicts that are arising are typically around identity issues, ethnic issues, religious issues, other kinds of cleavages in society. They tend to blur national and international boundaries. All you need to do is look at East Africa, and you'll see that the conflicts that are emerging have crossed borders in very significant ways, both in terms of the rebel groups, the refugees, and other aspects of the conflicts as well. And then finally, the conflicts today tend to be financed by corruption, criminal enterprises, other kinds of financing that support both rebel groups and government entities. As I mentioned, just to give you a little more pictorial representation of the change in conflict, this is a graph from the Uppsala Conflict Data Project at Uppsala University in Sweden, who we partner with at the Kroc Institute. And it actually is capturing the types of conflicts that are prevalent in the world all the way from 1946 to 2009. And as you can see, the red area is the area of internationalized civil wars. In other words, conflicts internally within countries between government and a rebel group, but that may have some international involvement. The yellow, as you might guess, is international wars. Very relatively few of those, and the number has declined somewhat over the last 50 years. The gray area, those were colonial wars, which largely have disappeared from the scene. But it gives you some idea of the massive growth in civil warfare over the last century. We're in the red, as you might see. One of the impacts of the rise of civil wars and the form of conflict that I've been describing is that a number of institutions in society are affected. We like to think of the picture like this. I designed this to kind of put forward what I think we imagine to be the case, that when the government has a conflict with a rebel group or an armed opposition, the conflict is largely between those two groups, and there's these other institutions that are around the outside. But what we see happening across the globe is that the conflict actually has impacts, significant impacts on all of these institutions. We see this in a number of ways. One way the conflict impacts institutions is through the corruption of government. If corruption is used as a main source of fueling conflict, that may create tendencies to spread corruption to other institutions. In my own case, as Lee mentioned, I lived and worked in Bangladesh in the early 90s. And I was always surprised that the universities were such violent places. In fact, before I would visit a university, particularly the main university in Dhaka, I would check the newspapers and the radio to find out if I was likely to get shot at. Now, that may sound unusual, but it was the place where a lot of political violence happened. And I asked my local colleagues there, why is this? Universities typically are places of learning and research. And they pointed out to me that in 1971, during the war, where Bangladesh basically formed its own country, separate from West Pakistan, the universities were politicized as part of the conflict. and that the politicization of the universities led to a lot of violence on campuses. One of the most prominent violent incidents of the war was the killing of a number of intellectuals at the university by the West Pakistani forces. It's commemorated every year in the newspaper. And what was interesting to me and somewhat surprising is that that legacy of violence had lived on for at least 20-some years in the university, even though the wider conflict had long been resolved. And now political parties, the two main parties in Bangladesh, would actually have a lot of violent conflict on university campuses, creating all kinds of problems for students trying to pursue their education. And I present that just as one example. You can think about each of these institutions and think about the kinds of impact that a civil war has on them. And particularly, we'll talk a little more about business. Now, this new kind of conflict has led to a need for new forms of peace building. And so I'd like to highlight what I think of as strategic peace building by contrasting it a little bit with conflict management. And I don't put these two ideas forward as alternatives. In fact, strategic peace building is in many ways a more holistic, a broader concept, which encompasses conflict management. But it goes beyond conflict management. So I'm going to contrast them just a bit. The traditional response to conflicts is something that I would call the conflict management approach. And it involves things which I think all of us are familiar with. Typically, the goal is ending violence, trying to get a ceasefire between warring parties. In order to do that, there's a focus on intervention with the parties that are in conflict, the political leaders and the militant groups. Usually, interventions are undertaken by a neutral external mediator. This may be a diplomat, if it's a diplomatic initiative, or it might be the military. Libya provides a telling example of this, where it's at least initially here been a largely military intervention to establish a no-fly zone, to bring the violence down, and hopefully try and resolve the situation. Then there is also usually a push towards reaching a peace agreement, which is obviously still part of strategic peace building, but often there's a lot of emphasis and pressure on the parties to sign something so that we can say that there's peace in this situation. Now, strategic peace building, as I said, is in many ways a more inclusive concept. It includes the idea of conflict management, but it tries to take a wider view. And that wider view includes not just a goal of ending violence, but a goal of building just relationships and institutions in society. Often that means trying to rebuild institutions that may have been damaged by the violence, not just physically, but in terms of their actual activities in society. Strategic peace building also involves interventions by multiple actors. It's not just a military activity. Lots of other actors, including NGOs, universities, businesses, outside groups, have a role to play. It's not always the same role as the neutral interveners from outside, but they have a role to play. Then a big emphasis of strategic peace building is on non-state actors. That conflict has lots of impact on actors outside of the state and the military, on civilian populations, and therefore there's a need to think about what roles various non-state actors can play. And then finally, another unique characteristic of strategic peace building is it tries to look beyond the peace agreement to the link between the peace agreement and the wider society. So it looks at whether the peace agreement is being implemented, if it calls for economic development in society or maybe development of a particular group in society, which some peace agreements do. Is that happening? And are there ways that businesses and NGOs and others can contribute to that? At the Kroc Institute, we've developed a diagram to just kind of illustrate this approach to strategic peace building. And it's divided into three broad areas. I won't go into lots of detail here, but just to kind of illustrate what we mean by strategic peace building. One aspect involves, in the upper right corner here, justice and healing. dealing with all the wrongs that were done during the conflict. There may be need for transitional justice institutions, or there may be need for trauma healing. In some societies, the level of trauma is quite high as a public health issue that needs to be dealt with. Down at the bottom is more dealing with current and ongoing conflicts. So here there's efforts at violence prevention, conflict resolution, conflict transformation, other things dealing with current conflicts or the immediate aftermath of conflicts. Then in the upper left, strategic peacebuilding looks to the future and tries to develop institutions that can support a more just society and a less violent society. Institutions like development or the rule of law and things like that. So this is just to give you an idea of the range of things that are involved in strategic peacebuilding. Now, I'd like to turn a little more narrowly to the question of how businesses and NGOs can collaborate on peacebuilding and look at a few trends and a few observations about what's going on. And I start with a couple of preliminary questions that basically motivated my thoughts on this. First is, what role is collaboration with NGOs playing in business engagement with peacebuilding? Is the NGO a prominent actor here, or are businesses largely doing this on their own? And if they are interacting with NGOs, what kinds of interaction are they, and what's the role that the NGO is playing? And this is related to my second question, is how does this compare with business-NGO collaboration on other issues, such as the environment? And I bring up the environment in particular because collaboration is fairly developed there. I would say it's further along than it is on peace issues. And so I'm kind of curious to see if the collaboration on environmental issues is kind of a model for peace building, or if peace building is kind of going its own way. Maybe it's got different issues that it's dealing with in terms of what kinds of collaboration are being found in the field. And I won't take the time to go into making the case for why businesses should be involved in peace building. I'm hoping that before this audience that case is already one that's established. I think if you haven't looked at it, the work by Fort and Schapani is really excellent on this. And I start with their framework for understanding the particular ways that business can be involved in peace building. And they lay out 4 different ways that I think it provides a nice framework for thinking about how businesses can be involved. First, they can be involved in equitable economic development. Clearly, development is something significantly needed in post-conflict environments and even in situations marked by conflict to kind of overcome some of the issues that may have led to warfare. Secondly, businesses can be involved in peace processes. You may think that sounds unusual, but I'll give you a few cases of how that's happened, and some fairly prominent. Thirdly, businesses can be involved in transparency and rule of law initiatives to basically encourage good governance that hopefully would avoid conflict in the future. And then finally, businesses, particularly those working at the local level, can be involved in initiatives that build a sense of community and foster social cohesion, particularly in areas where there have been sharp cleavages between groups on the ground. Now, it was interesting to me just to kind of bring the Fort framework together with ours at Kroc, that these initiatives kind of fall at different points on the wheel. Business involvement in peace processes is pretty much far on the right, which generally means the conflict is a lot hotter at that particular place. Community building also fits in nicely with some efforts that are often undertaken by NGOs in post-conflict situations. Development we already had on our wheel. And the rule of law and transparency issues, which in many ways are the kind of the long-term contribution, are the kind of thing we're thinking of when we talk about advocacy and solidarity and the rule of law as a peace-building activity. So then to get to the facts, I'm trying to assess the current state of collaboration. And my methodology is what I would call an armchair methodology. I'll just be upfront. I haven't done heavy-duty quantitative analysis. There isn't really the data out there to do that anyway. This is very much just the observations of somebody looking in based on reports and other things that I'm able to find. I do find it interesting that corporations make fairly little reference in their Global Compact reports and other reports on social contributions to peace and conflict. You'll find a few, but the references are a lot less than you'd find in other areas. There may be reasons for that we could discuss. I do note also, though, in contrast to that, there's a lot more information about business-NGO collaboration from the NGO side. If you look at International Alert or the Business and Human Rights Resource Center, there's a vast number, I would say over 100 reports of relevance to these issues, often with case studies of particular business-NGO collaborations. And that's what I've relied on largely in my own research on this. So what did I find in looking at trying to get a handle on the big picture here? Well, I won't take the time to go into detail on all of these, but just to note that in each area, I'm trying to identify a few examples that I think are prominent and often put forward as models to follow, and then I'm looking at what characteristics do those examples have in terms of the business-NGO interaction. And just quickly to highlight a couple of things, in the development area, perhaps the most prominent example I find of development in contexts of peace, in contexts where there's a serious conflict and the development effort is being done to foster peace building. A prominent example is GM's role in Colombia, fostering reintegration. They supported efforts there to reintegrate former combatants into a business there. Lots of other national firms have followed suit and are also doing similar activities, in some cases with the same NGOs and in some cases with others. Now, what's interesting is that in looking at development as a peace-building activity with NGOs, the stuff I'm finding indicates it's mostly done with national firms rather than the multinational corporations. And I also found it interesting that there's some fears about publicity about this. Not just among the multinationals, but amongst the national firms. And in fact, some of the reports I found were anonymous, or they would not identify the actual organization doing the work. So there's some interaction here with NGOs, but it's kind of varied as far as I could find. Secondly, on peace processes, what's happening here? Well, there's been actually a lot of interesting research on business involvement in peace processes themselves. And the cases of El Salvador and Sri Lanka and Northern Ireland in particular, there's been a lot of analysis of the positive role that businesses play. A second area that I think is kind of interesting is what's recently happened in Egypt and Tunisia, where Google and Facebook had some significant involvement. Not necessarily in what we'd traditionally call a peace process, but in something even better, a nonviolent revolution. Peace people like those kinds of things. Now, I realize that they didn't play an official role in Egypt, although Google did take some steps to help the revolution continue. It did have, obviously, one of its prominent employees working on the revolution, but they tried to classify that as his own personal involvement, not an involvement of the company. But nonetheless, Google has been seen as helping support a nonviolent revolution. Now, what's interesting about the peace process area is local businesses, by which I mean national and local, seem almost more willing to get involved in some cases. If they're united. That's been the finding I've found, is if they can get wide community support of several businesses, they're willing to sort of take a stand for peace, often because the people who own the businesses are part of the situation and understand the impact of the conflict. But if the business community is divided, things don't seem to go so well. People are less willing to take stands in that particular case. But if they do take stands, they tend to do it directly. NGOs don't, to me, seem to get involved as much here. The businesses work directly with the peace process or the government. But in some cases, interestingly enough, the businesses, when they have created a consortium, have created an NGO, in order to facilitate their activities. And that NGO may continue on its own after the peace process has completed. Then quickly, just to mention the last two areas, transparency and rule of law is an area where there's been lots of activity by businesses. And I list just a few of the prominent ones here. The Kimberley process, the new processes that are going on around conflict minerals in the DRC. There's the voluntary principles of security and human rights. And the Global Compact itself has issued a guidance on this area with input from businesses and NGOs. And what's interesting about this area is it's mostly multinational corporations and international NGOs that are doing this kind of norm setting, is what I think of it. And secondly, it's interesting that once again, it's coalitions rather than one-to-one partnerships that we're seeing. So this isn't one company partnering with a local NGO or even an international NGO to do some kind of peace activity. It's a group of businesses and NGOs, often a consortium of a very large group where membership and withdrawing membership is your key factor. The NGO role here is then largely one of legitimation. The NGOs give a certain credibility to the process, and they understand this, that that's their role. And then if they threaten to leave the process, they realize that that's the sort of leverage they have with the businesses they're working with. Then finally, just a quick comment on the community level. There has been a lot of activity on policy issues, particularly personnel policies, for dealing with conflict-affected areas. I like the work here of CDA Incorporated, which is Mary Anderson's group in Cambridge, Massachusetts. They do a lot of consulting and actually post a lot of their consulting findings on businesses working in conflicted areas. And it's quite interesting to see what people are thinking about here in terms of how to deal with a business maybe in an area of ethnic conflict in a post-conflict situation, and how you might use things like equality in hiring to deal with conflict issues. Once again, this has been led a lot by extractive industries working in areas of conflict, but there's been some other involvement as well of local NGOs, local businesses through their philanthropy with NGOs. So just a few quick observations and then a couple of conclusions. First, as I've pointed out throughout, coalitions are much more common, as far as I can find, than one-to-one partnerships in this area. And this may be a difference from, I know there's coalitions in other areas of business NGO relations as well, but I think it's quite strong here. And I think there's some reasons for that. I'm just speculating, but I know one reason that has been articulated is that peace is a politically sensitive issue, and it's very tough to take an individual stand as a business on a peace issue. Whereas if you know lots of other businesses are involved, or even NGOs, it's a lot easier to kind of wade into a politically charged sort of issue. So in some ways, it's not surprising we're seeing coalitions here. A second thing I think I just have observed is it appears there's differences between multinationals and national firms in their involvement. The multinationals are focusing a lot on establishing minimum norms and working out agreements on what's expected in conflict situations, whereas the national firms seem to be a little more willing to engage in what I would call positive peace building, where they engage in a peace process or engage in business efforts that are directly aimed at sort of social cohesion amongst the population. And in some ways, this isn't surprising. The same pattern plays out in the NGO sector. Local NGOs are willing to do and able to do a lot more in terms of politics of the local community than international NGOs. And in fact, there are very good reasons for that. I guess what I see happening is that same pattern is being replicated in the business sector. And then finally, I would point out that a lot of the activity that's going on is to deal with the extractive industries. Both in terms of the norm setting and other aspects of what's going on, which is something interesting to point out. There have been efforts to work with the financial industries and some other sectors, and I think those are great. They just aren't as far along as the extractive industries. So just to bring this to a conclusion, and make a couple of try to pull some synthesis together to this. First of all, I think peace-building norms, the kind of things that are being set by some of these coalitions, are very helpful and much needed. But they only can go so far. Peace-building is a very difficult thing to reduce to norms of behavior that apply around the world in different situations. Peace-building is much more tailored to the particular situation that you're involved in. And so it's difficult to establish norms for this. I think we should keep trying, and I think we're getting somewhere. But we can't expect norms to do everything that needs to be done here. Secondly, I think we need to think about how corporate engagement in peace-building can get beyond the extractive industry, particularly in the economic development and the community building areas. Other businesses that are engaged in post-conflict work can have a major contribution here to peace-building if they think about their work more in terms of its impact on the conflict and on the peace process. A third conclusion is that supply chains provide an important opportunity for both expanding efforts at peace building and also for learning. In some cases, I think national firms actually have learned some interesting things about peace building that they should share with multinationals more. And they may be doing things in a different way. And I think promoting some interaction on these issues would benefit all. And then finally, just putting on my NGO hat, I think that businesses could learn more from NGOs. NGOs have particularly extensive experience in post-conflict peacebuilding and development that I don't see being shared as much as it could. In particular, I'm thinking of things like reintegration of victims and of child soldiers and of others in communities. This is an area that I found it very interesting to see businesses doing this on their own, often with governments, without really even consulting NGOs, who have been doing this for 15 or 20 years and have learned a lot in the process of doing that. So I'll conclude with a call for more interaction with NGOs on these kinds of issues. Thank you very much.